Mainstream media have an alternate reality, and that alternate reality, giant multinational corporations are always right. They're the center of the country, and everyone should bow their heads. And people under 45, the online generations, millennials and Gen Z, are going, hell no.
Welcome to the content category. I'm super excited and honored to be here with Cenk Uygur. He's the CEO of TYT. Cenk, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Rock and roll. Excited to do it.
Awesome. Why we're having this conversation, we looked at well over 1,000 companies, what we consider in the content category. It was pretty overwhelming, but one of the companies that really stood out to us was TYT, both on not only their focus and what they're doing in the political and news space, the content that they create, the volume of the content they create, but also the distribution strategy that they have. And it's pretty impressive, especially for a category that's very difficult to operate and play in, what they've built today. So it's fantastic to have you here. I really appreciate it. We're going to jump into questions about how you built the platform and how you've navigated this space. Before we jump into questions, I think you provided us with a fantastic video that we can share with the audience about who is TYT, and then we'll get into it. Sounds good?
Yep.
You are the media revolution. You are much needed.
TYT!
It's like 95% TYT on.
You guys, the Young Turks, which is my favorite channel, we're getting that message out.
Cenk and the Young Turks do an extraordinarily good job.
No matter what mainstream media says, you have to listen to the Young Turks.
The people who support us on the internet, that's what gives us strength. One side seems to be winning. They seem to have a bigger army. There might be a reason for that. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. I think it's a fantastic video, Cenk. Did you have anything that you wanted to share on top of that, or any descriptions about who is TYT? And then I'm even curious, taking one step further, I know you guys have been around for a while. Is there a backstory behind why you started TYT?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We just celebrated our 19th anniversary, and that's overall. We started as a radio show. We were Sirius Satellite Radio's first original talk show. I love being first. We were YouTube's first ever partner channel. So when Susan Wojcicki started her channel on YouTube, I was her first guest since we were the first partners. And we're actually the longest running show in internet history. So that we started right around the same time YouTube did on our own website in 2005. And we've been broadcasting daily ever since. We now have grown to over a dozen platforms, 500 million views per month. But the video features the audience because that's who we are. We are built completely from the audience. We had nothing when we started. I started in my 1-bedroom apartment on Sunset. It might be hokey and corny, but it's 100% true. No connections, no money, no nothing. And that audience found us, picked us up, and put us at the top. And I love them for it. And that's why I say we're not the Young Turks, they're the Young Turks.
Wow. No, it's fantastic. And I think it's really impressive where you started and how you built. And I want to get into that, but I first want to start general. And one of the things, just generally in content first off, one of the things that for any companies within the content category, any company creating content, one of the things that really impressed me is the amount, the quantity of content that you're able to create. How do you create content at scale? And how do you balance this quality and quantity challenge?
Yeah, we just skip the quality part and go to quantity, and then it's solved. Look, as you alluded to in the intro there, Kyle, this is not an easy industry. This is very challenging. And I think it's about to get easier for reasons I can explain. But for 15 years that we've been doing online video, it has been brutal. And so you can't do it if you're not super efficient. So what does super efficient mean in this context? It means you create a content that could be sliced and diced and put onto many different platforms. So early on, we figured out a couple of things that other folks took a while to get to. We figured out you do a longer show, and that's good for your live audience. And eventually, I had always had a vision of a 24-hour channel like cable news. And now that's come to reality. We're on Pluto, Roku, Comcast Xfinity, Samsung, Xumo, YouTube TV. And so we have a 24-hour channel with shows built to be like long form television shows. But they're also built so that they could be broken out into segments, and segments that are then made into clips and put on YouTube, Facebook, and our other platforms. And I can get into granular detail on what kind of content works on what kind of platform. But whenever we're building something new, we're always keeping in mind synergies and how we're going to utilize that content across all different platforms. And by the way, the other efficiency there, and I might be a part of the later conversation, is in 2005, I don't know that we invented freemium, but we were probably close. So we came up with a model of giving people most of your content, but then doing some special broadcasts and obviously being able to watch all of our content if you become a member. And we did that because out of necessity, we weren't large enough for people to want to go behind a paywall, but we had a very loyal core audience who really loved the show and identified with the show and wanted to power the show, and we really needed it. So we set up the freemium model so that anybody could watch live and get hooked on it, but then become a member and support the show if they really loved it and wanted extra. And that helped us get through the lean years and survive to now.
Interesting. And I actually want to get into that a little bit because I think the focus that you took at the beginning was far ahead of everybody else, especially for your category for political and news content. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is the trends that we see, especially for companies that create content that's used to be distributed across different platforms, really try to group content together into brands. And I think you guys have done an impressive approach in building out different types of shows and brands internally. I'm just curious, why is it important for you to create these types of brands and shows? And how do you even go about that process of creating a brand, especially for the news and political content?
Yeah, so two separate questions there. Why is a brand so important to build, and how do you build it? In terms of why it's important to build, well, look, honestly, that was the whole reason I got into this. I wrote an email to my friends back in 1998, and I said, I think online video is going to beat TV. They said, you're nuts, of course. And to be fair to them, they said it'd take at least 20 years, even if that were true. And it turns out they were right about that. But the idea here is that you can start something online at a relatively low cost without having to build a multi-billion-dollar television station and network. And the main thing to do is to build a brand online so that when the worlds merge, when the online video and TV merges, which is pretty much where we are now, we're at that inflection point, then brands dominate. And so on that note, we were 100%. So right now, the TYT brand online is super strong. So almost everyone who watches any shred of news online knows who TYT is. And it's a really interesting paradigm because you get above 45-year-olds that don't watch content online and they'll have no idea who we are. To them, they'll be like, oh, what is that? Is that what the kids are watching? But if you're under 45, you grew up on us. When I ask folks that I meet on the street, why do you watch us? The number one answer is, what else would I watch? Name another daily news show that's been on the air for 15 years online. You literally can't do it. And so what does that create? Now, let's create a situation where TYT is a global brand. I was in Portugal a couple of years back, the waiters giving me hugs. It doesn't matter where I go, Turkey, Portugal, France, everyone recognizes us in the streets. I asked a person in France or my kids, what does CBS mean? They go, I don't know, random collection of letters. They have literally never heard of CBS. So I just took a couple of $1 billion of branding off their hands and I did it on the cheap. So sad day for them. We were right. So how do you build a brand? That's the hard part. And if you're going to try to do it with tricks and gimmicks, I wish you a lot of luck. I love the online audience. I love it. I love it. I love it. TV audience, the older audience that's on TV, honestly, just barely knows anything about the world because they got fed pulp by television. So they just know like silly little talking points. They don't know any details. They think they know politics and news, but barely know anything. So there's this hilarious thing where like older generations think, oh, millennials, they don't know anything. No, millennials will kick your ass in knowledge when it comes to politics and news. Because you know why? They grew up on the internet where you could Google things so you could actually find out specific policy ideas. Last time that television did an interesting analysis of policy was approximately never. And by the way, I was on a panel with someone who worked at ABC News, and she said, look, you have an unfair advantage. So you can go into any topic for as long as you want because it lives online. We have to do content that is very broad and non-specific because we're trying to reach a really broad audience. That's why they never tell you anything related to policy. There's other reasons too that are political in nature. So online, if you want to build a brand, especially in our industry, you better be authentic. If you're not authentic and you're not passionate, nobody's interested. So the old news model of I bring out Wolf Blitzer and he acts like a robot and he's dispassionate, and then I get kudos from other people in the same intellectual elite circles who go, "Oh, way to not care about the news! Bravo! You did such a wonderful dispassionate job." And TYT says they seem to care about the news. That's unacceptable. Acceptable or not, we won and you didn't.
No, it's fantastic. The company that you've built and obviously the brand TYT is fantastic. And even underneath internally, the content groups that you built with either the specific hosts, the specific channels, or content verticals that you focus on internally, I think is fantastic and a really great way to engage with audience who kind of demand, especially online, for specific forms of content. But I'm curious from your perspective, because we experiment with this with a lot of companies that are in the entertainment space and the sports. And from your perspective, I'm curious, is content creation from your team, is this and I know it's news, so it's slightly different, so take this question as you will, but is this for you more of an art form, or is this a data-driven decision-making process of the type of content that you create?
Yeah, so a slight combination, but heavily leaning towards editorial decisions as opposed to data-driven decisions. But that's a really complicated answer. So let me break it down. On a day-to-day basis, when you're doing a production meeting for what's going to be in the show that day, will you be cognizant of the hot topics? Yes. Will you be driven by them? No. Otherwise, you're doing a plastic show with robotic anchors, and you might as well just get some CGI or something and go, today's news number one trending topic is, and in a lot of ways, some folks do that, listicles, etc. The reason why I don't think that that's a good long-term model, even if you put editorial and ideological reasons behind, is that it divorces you from the passion and the authenticity that you need to build a good brand online. So robots are not interesting to people, especially online. And you can build something big that way, but it will be ephemeral. By definition, you're building your castles in the sand. They're going to get washed away. There's no characters that people get attached to. There's no brand that they get attached to. On the other hand, when we look at how to win on the different platforms and look to solve the algorithms, we're maniacally driven by the data, and it would be foolish not to be. So how does that play out? How do those two worlds, in a sense, not intersect, right? You could editorially choose to do a topic that's, for example, when corporations withdrew their funding of politicians after the Capitol riots. Well, that's an interesting story. I have no idea if the algorithm likes that story or not, probably not, but that's a story we're going to do because it's very interesting editorially. But then you apply data learnings to that story when you publish it. So in titling, thumbnails, tags, time of day, length of video, all those things are then applied to editorial content you chose independently of whether they're doing well or not, that you chose based on the substance.
It definitely makes sense. And I feel as though, given lived and breathed the world of the internet since very early on and lived on these platforms, the role of being authentic, I think, is a very important and complicated dynamic. And as a news company, I think it's very hard to kind of balance that mix of shocking content, but not getting into the shocking content trap, but also making sure that great content is communicated with your user base in a way that is important, even though it may not be something very appealing on the outside. And I think that is an art form, but at the same time, how you mentioned understanding how platforms works, I think is also a really important strategy overall. But I wanted to dive in what I think is absolutely impressive about what you've built and what you've started from the very beginning, which was your method of content distribution. You already mentioned it before, focusing on that freemium model. I think you really capitalized on this discovery aspect, especially early on. And it seems like this is something that you continue to do today. And you live in both worlds. You have your own platforms, but you're also on television. You have audio content. You have a lot of content on social networks. And is this going to be continuing to be your strategy? Because it feels like, especially for news and politics, most companies seem like they try to grab users and pull them onto their own platform and keep them there. And like they try to stay away from, or generally individual smaller companies tend to stay away from distributing content, especially this type of content across other platforms. I'm just curious, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So there's the old cliche about how necessity is the mother of invention. And so since we had such a threadbare budget, we had to do things that were 100% logical. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. So if you're operating that way, you will obviously go to where the audience is. You do not have the luxury of sitting around going, I hope the audience stumbles upon tyt.com, right? No, they're not going to stumble upon it. And especially if you don't have a big enough budget, you'll never be able to pull off the SEO required to build a giant website, which then draws independent traffic. You must go to where the audience is. And so I remember when we had started, like I said, right around when YouTube had started. YouTube was so new, we didn't even know about it. And I remember after we would do the shows, we'd go, okay, where do we put the clips? And we tried MySpace. We tried Yahoo Messenger. I don't know if that made any sense. We tried emailing it to friends and family. And then one day, and we all do it like it's all duct tape. Jesus, the director of the show, JR was the producer of the show, and there were interns that we got from USC and the local schools, etc. Anyway, one day Jesus says, there's this thing called YouTube, and I put it up there, and it's got like way more views than MySpace. We're like, I think we broke 100. So back then, like getting 100 views, like, whoa, this YouTube thing might be for real. And if you do that organically, you'll find where the audience is. And so obviously YouTube just took off, and that was the natural place to build. It doesn't mean that you're a YouTube show. It just means that that's where you got started and where your home base was, and arguably still is, because after all these years, the majority of the audience is really the giant lion's share is still on two platforms, YouTube and Facebook. And for long-term viewing, YouTube still is dominant. And Twitch is interesting. It's an interesting third outlet that's kind of closing. It's got closing speed, but it's still got a long way to go. But we like it.
I definitely agree with this the sentiment of understanding where the audience is. And even as a content creator, I would think is at the very beginning, being able to connect with them, but also have other outlets as well, and balancing both your own platform, your own website, your own outlets, that ways you engage different audiences, but also not really pushing out the ability to connect with users on these platforms where majority of most people are. And I think that's a great strategy that you start from the beginning.
Yeah, just real quick. I remember we went to the South by speech by Jonah Peretti about what a new thing that BuzzFeed was going to reveal, a new strategy. This was, I don't know, probably about 4 years ago or so. And it was hilarious because the title of the talk was so clickbaity, and I was like, that's so perfect. Anyway, and don't get me wrong, I really respect BuzzFeed and Jonah, and I think they're going to be one of the survivors of this digital media rolling apocalypse. No, seriously, it's a tough industry, and I think BuzzFeed's going to survive it, and I have tremendous respect for them. But we got there, and the big reveal of this dramatic new strategy was, it turns out the audience is on YouTube and Facebook, and that's where you should go, and stop trying to build your own website. It's too hard. I was like, oh, okay. And by the way, though, Kyle, you're right to ask it. And Jonah was right to give that speech. And he was ahead of most other people, because to this day, people are still wondering, should I build on my own website? You can if you got a couple of $1 billion, in my opinion. And it doesn't mean you should never drive to your website. You should. But it's a thing you've got to work towards and be really strategic about in terms of when and how you execute that.
Absolutely makes sense. And it seems like for some reason, the news and political content category seems to have a difficult time understanding where their audience is for a lot of newer companies that are popping up. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and it's obviously top of mind, the environment that we live in, the world that we live in the last few years, it doesn't seem real, nothing seems real anymore. But there's been some really weird, interesting dynamics between users, content, social networks. We're seeing some social networks shut down. We're seeing political figures banned. We're seeing like a lot of weird dynamics happening in media that draw a lot of different questions and thoughts. And as a platform, as a content creator, but especially as an individual in the news and media and political space, what are your thoughts about this turbulence that's happening in your industry? Does this change the way in which you create content, may distribute content, or just navigate something like this?
It's a great question because number one, there's really tough issues here that are not easy to navigate. And number two, it goes towards a phenomenon that not everybody's caught on to yet. Okay, I love the freedom of online. I love that it took away the gatekeepers. In my experience, the gatekeepers, let's just say they're counterproductive. They have no idea how to pick talent or shows or anything. All this self-congratulatory stuff like, oh, I once picked this person to be right. Really? How many did you pick wrong? And yeah, I could get 1 out of 20 right too, and then brag about that the rest of my career. It's not their fault. It's just an inefficient system. When I first came to LA, they were doing 10 pilots and picking up only one. And then of the one that they picked up, they would kill most of those after 6 episodes or at most 13 episodes. They're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars to get one successful show. It was the most insanely inefficient system I have ever seen. Online, you put up a show. Did people like it? Okay, there you have your answer. Okay, you know who the gatekeeper is? The gatekeeper is the audience. And so that's the part of the internet I love. But the problem, of course, as we all discovered, was that once you take away the gatekeepers, there's a problem. The problem is everybody comes in. And so I love the masses. As you might be able to tell from this conversation, not a big fan of the elitist attitude that a lot of people have in media and in business. But I'm also cognizant that not everybody is sane. And so ghouls and goblins have come in and been empowered, because what is online really great at? Building communities, among other things. And so we built a community of progressives who are sane and care about the world and want to drive positive change in the world, and yet do that aggressively. But others built other communities. And some of the communities they built were for communities of lunatics, of who think that there is brain juice harvesting, et cetera. And we laugh about it, Kyle, but it's real, and it was shockingly effective. QAnon is probably still underestimated. I think QAnon, people who believe it, are near 10% of the country. And I think a third of the country is in the spectrum of insanity, where they believe things that cannot possibly be true, that no sane person would ever believe. All right. And part of the fault there is also social media. One, they opened the gates. Everybody came in. Two, they created communities of different pockets of insanity. And some of those pockets then led to violence. Oh my God, now we're in real disaster mode. But then on top of that, the social media unwittingly had them see only the information that reinforced their opinions. And that just set up a vicious cycle. And so I was talking to a former cop who until recently was a QAnon supporter, did an interview on the show. And he said he just didn't, to this day does not have access to the information that we have. He thinks like Black Lives Matter only wants to either physically hurt or kill cops. He's never heard any of their constructive solutions for how to fix systemic racism. He then started talking about systemic racism and how Black Lives Matter should be addressing that. I'm like, oh my God, they do. That's the main thing that they do. He never, ever heard it, because in his ecosystem, he was only being fed insanity and things that are not true. And so that's a giant downside. Okay. But at the same time, there's an overreaction to it. It then is driving everybody to go, okay, back to the gatekeepers, back to everybody getting put in a veal pen and a spectrum of acceptable thought. So in the spectrum of acceptable thought that's on television and mainstream media has been a disaster for this country. And so politically speaking, only centrist ideas are allowed, which are not at all the center of the country. They're massively right-wing. They're preposterously right-wing when it comes, and I could prove it in the polling. It's not my opinion. It's a fact based on the polling. 2/3 of the country wants policy proposals that TV and the New York Times and NPR find to be completely unacceptable. And they will paint it as radical when it's the least radical thing in the world. I'll give you a quick example. And almost everyone who's watching, who's in the management class, which is almost everyone, will immediately rebel because they have been brought up on mainstream media. So when I tell you that Medicare for all is intensely popular in the country, including by majority of Republicans who go, oh, no way. Joe Scarborough told me that it's unpopular. Every Republican and every Democratic politician told me it's unpopular. That's because they apparently don't have eyes. They can't read a poll. It started at 70% popularity. TV pummeled it. They spent billions of dollars trying to destroy Medicare for all. And okay, they did a good job of knocking off 15 points. It's still at 55% popularity. And if you had a fair playing field, it'd be at 90%. No, to be fair, it'd be at the same popularity that Medicare is at, which is about 77%. Okay. Mainstream media has an alternate reality as well. Trump people have an alternate reality. Mainstream media have an alternate reality. And that alternate reality, giant multinational corporations are always right. They're the center of the country, and everyone should bow their heads and accept lower wages, less health care, destroying the planet, etc. And people under 45, the online generations, millennials and Gen Z, are going, hell no, hell no. We don't accept your alternate reality. It isn't true. You haven't looked up a single thing in your life. 2/3 of the country wants Green New Deal, the essence, the policies of Green New Deal. Yes, Anderson Cooper and Tucker Carlson might have worked together to destroy the labels and the branding and the framing of Medicare for All and Green New Deal. But in terms of the policies and the issues, the whole country's on our side. And so at least 2/3 of it is. And so I don't want to go back to that alternate reality either. I want to find a way to navigate without the gatekeepers and while keeping the physically violent at bay. And so that has been a very tough balancing act, especially in the Trump era.
Interesting. Well, especially as a company that creates content and seeing that you live both in the social networks and other platforms, but also you have your own platform, and being able to balance the two kind of gets you in that neutral position, regardless of how the dynamics of how things shake up or how different platforms moderate or do what they do with their platforms. It still has, you guys have a lot of flexibility, which I think is a great strategy overall as a company, especially for the type of content that you, in the content world that you live in, which I think is the hardest.
Yeah, and Kyle, sorry, I'm going to jump in because there's something else really important there, which is brand safety. And it's outdated and it makes no sense. Let me first give a nod to why it exists. I know why it exists, because you don't want your product advertised with Alex Jones, who's telling people that Sandy Hook wasn't real and that you should go harass the parents of the victims. I don't want my product there either. I get it, right? At the same time, brand safety has led to vanilla programming that is divorced of all passion and honestly divorced of anything interesting. And I've been in 1,000 TV production meetings where they start the conversation with, what does Walmart want? Honestly, Walmart wants an insipid show that offends no one and somehow miraculously gets all the audience anyway. And in the old TV days, you could deliver that because that was your only option. There was just one tube in your house, and you, whether you liked it or not, that's the thing you watched. So Walmart and all the rest of them could shove their products down your throat, and there was nothing you could do about it. But in the ocean of content that is digital media, it's not just that the media companies that are obsessed with brand safety are going to get their world rocked. It's the actual brands that are going to get their world rocked. If you're going to under 45-year-olds and you're telling them, I can't tell if Black Lives Matter, if Black lives should matter or shouldn't matter. I'm at 50-50. I'm neutral. I'm brand safe. They're going to tell you to go take a long walk off a short dock. No, we all know Black Lives Matter. And if you can't make up your mind about that, you're a monster. You're not really brand safe. So this whole idea of brand safety will eventually drive almost all of them to bankruptcy.
I have to ask you, because media overall is a very tough category if you're looking at the entire tech ecosystem, but any company or any category in the industry. And I would argue that generally political and news content is even the hardest. So the fact that you've started from a long time ago and continue to this day, I think really showcases a lot of what you've built as a brand, but also your content. And you feel it's really impressive. But the one thing I wanted to ask you specifically for your content category is, it feels like news and political media recently has received a heavy amount of criticism over the past few years, whether it's political attacks, whether it's polarizing politics, whether it's a sentiment of distrust. Has this affected your company, and how do you mitigate something like this?
The main effect, honestly, is just driving away advertisers. So it's scared the bejesus out of every advertiser. But it's not just advertisers, it's the platforms too. So they view some brands as safe, which means corporate friendly, boring, etc. But if you're exciting, and especially if you're aggressive, ooh, no, I do declare we want fake passion, not real passion. And so now, I won't name names because this company I don't respect as much, but there are some that made the appearance of being radical, but in reality were, of course, just a giant advertising vehicle to do propaganda on behalf of brands. That's okay. That's the model. And then they tested the brand and found out it ranked at the very bottom. Everyone in the business community thought it was the hottest, most radical, most connected to the youth brand. And when they actually asked the audience, they were like, no, dead last. Like they think General Motors was a more authentic brand. Okay. So we're so authentic that, for lack of a better word, it scares or bothers the management class. And those are the folks who make the decisions on advertising. And that I care less about, because we have programmatic advertising and we have membership. We're all good. We have a model that works, and we're rocking and rolling, and so we don't need any big ad deals, and we don't need to play that game. But when it comes to the streaming services, the executives there still live from a disconnected world where they're thinking about it from their perspective, and they're good, smart, honest, decent people. They're just looking at it from their own bubble, and they can't see outside of their bubble. So just a quick note to them: passion is good, as long as it's not anything crazy or physical. It's like, you like passion in entertainment, and you like it in sports. When Stephen A. Smith gets passionate and yells about something, they're like, yeah, that's great. When the reality show stars do whatever the hell they do, the outrageous things, brands are okay with it, etc. But when it comes to news, if you actually are a little bit passionate and you care about driving positive change in the world, they're like, whoa, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. But that attitude's never going to win. It's never going to win. You throw up vanilla online and I'll beat it 1,000 out of 1,000 times. So eventually people are going to have to come to the table and realize this is what actual human beings want. This is what the people want. And so you're not arguing against me. You're arguing against my 500 million viewers. And so you're not going to win that argument. I'm going to win in the long run.
That makes sense. And I think one of the things that you've done early on, being as a digital media company and living on these different social platforms at the very beginning, is internet users they're not nice. They're very difficult. They expect 100% of this being authentic. And you're right, that vanilla content does not survive at all. And it's interesting to see how for you really sticking true to your content core and your messaging and continuing to follow that. And I do believe that generally over time, corporations are realizing that there's no other option. The world's living online now, and online there's passion in every vertical, and you have to be able to pick and choose where you want to connect with different users.
Yeah, Kyle, there's something called the good economy that you've probably heard of. And so I just read an article on Market Watch. It was featuring Joe Sandberg, who's a philanthropist, but also started some of the biggest companies you've heard of. Early investor, one of the first investors in Blue Apron. He did Aspiration, et cetera. So really smart guy and incredibly successful at business. And he and others can see where the trend is going. You got to pick a side. And I don't mean politically, I don't mean Republican or Democrat. In fact, that might be counterproductive, but you got to pick a side of, are you doing good in the world or aren't you? And so if you say, again, you just name any topic, gay rights, I can't tell. Should gay people have rights or not? No, not going to work. Not going to work. I'm being brand safe. No, you're not. You're killing yourself. And sometimes they look at me as they want to shoot the messenger. Oh, that guy's message is making me uncomfortable. He's making me think about changing the way that I've operated my whole life. So I don't like him. But you're not getting it. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you. Your brand is going to sink if you keep insisting on doing things that 2 generations of Americans, the ones that are going to buy all of your products going forward, they can't stand it. If you can't make up your mind about gay rights, black rights, you name it, the environment, okay? So if you keep telling them, I'm just not sure if I should be good or evil, they're going to believe you, and they're going to think that's not someone I want to spend my money on. They're basically voting with their dollars, and they're going to vote against you. I'm here to try to save you.
Definitely makes sense. And I'm judging by your sentiment that you feel as though a lot of corporations, especially given what's happening in the media cycle, are now warming up to this idea that they have to make a choice. There's no real way to play in the middle ground or pretend that you can't take a side on specific positions, and they'll probably come back forward into being an advertiser, working with platforms like yourself.
Oh, definitely. So we led on Colin Kaepernick. We were the first out of the gate to immediately say he's an American hero. And that was when he was saying the most heat and you name it. And we were like, nope, you guys are 1,000,000,000% wrong. It's not a 50-50 question. And if you think he's doing it as an attack against the military, you're just not factually correct. He asked the veterans. They said kneeling was the most respectful way of doing it. He's talking about police abuse. The police abuse is real. These are all facts. And if you say, and almost every brand did, no, if you're taking sides on Kaepernick, I'm not interested. That's not brand safe. I'm super scared. And then what happened? Nike came along and was many years later and said, in essence, okay, TYT was right. It turns out younger people think Kaepernick's a hero. We're going to feature Kaepernick in an ad. Initially, their stock price went down because all the management class, which invests on the stock market, is totally clueless about young people. So they're like, oh, I do declare. Here we go again, right? Oh, no, Kaepernick taking a knee. I heard from Fox News that was disrespectful to the military. He hates the military. I hate him. That's not brand safe. Okay, so Nike goes down. And as the rest of the story, what did they gain? $6 billion in market cap afterwards? I forget the exact number, but it was in the billions. And they made the right call. Why? Under 45-year-olds buy sneakers. Over 45-year-olds don't. Okay, so that's the market. That's their market. And they were the smartest. And they were the quickest, which makes sense given that they're Nike. Okay. And so they figured out where their business interests lie. I'm not asking you to make moral decisions. I'm asking you to make financially sound decisions. And right now, 90% of the market is still at financially wrong decisions because they're thinking about it from their perspective, which is honestly, literally an old perspective that's outdated and will cost you your entire young customer base.
That makes sense. And it's interesting that you're in that position. And I, applaud you in being able to understand, especially the younger crowd and knowing the dynamics of these social networks and different platforms and how to engage with them and being able to also have candid discussions about topics that for a lot of companies are hard to navigate and try to avoid. But I'm switching gears a little bit now that we're on this specific topic about advertising. I think you are probably one of the most successful media companies for this category and comparing you to the rest of the startup ecosystem for companies that are new and old. However, it seems like a lot of political and news media companies really struggle when it comes to monetization. And it's for you, especially in the early beginnings, relying on a lot of variety of distribution platforms. You were a freemium model. What was the business model that's allowed you to sustain yourself? And how do you think, and I guess, how has that monetization strategies evolved over time?
Yeah, that's why we came up with freemium before there was a word for it, because it rewards loyalty and passion and identity. So the reality is that a lot of people subscribe to us because they're looking for extra content or convenience, but probably most subscribe because they love us. And so you go to rallies and people will see us and start chanting TYT. Have you ever heard anybody chanting CNN? CNN? No, never. So if CNN could have a subscription basis, but only if they're part of a cable package. So if they went online and said, hey, become a CNN member so you can see more of Wolf Blitzer, good luck. So now that leads to an obvious conundrum. If you're from the old world, and which almost all of our competitors are, at least they're no, almost all. There's a couple of young guys who understand the world of millennials, but even they get sucked into the brand safety problem. The conundrum is if you are passionate enough to get paying subscribers, you become brand unsafe. Because advertisers don't want to take the 5 minutes that it takes to figure out who's Alex Jones, who's CNN, who's TYT, who's Secular Talk, et cetera. They're like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do the homework. So they just go, if they're not a brand I already know from television, then that's it. They're the untouchables. Okay, so that then forces people on our side of the equation to pick a lane. Because if you're going to be brand safe, you're not going to get an audience. You're going to get lots of advertisers, but you're not going to get an audience. If you pick our lane, then you're going to get an audience, and you might be able to do paid subscriber if you do it well enough, and you might be able to get programmatic, but you really have to be careful because that's a tough thing to sustain yourself on. You will not get big advertisers. And some people just jump off the cliff and go out of business because they never made up their mind. Some have a good but limited business. They'll get giant contracts from Lockheed Martin and Pfizer and ExxonMobil, and they will. It's a real business, and they'll put together events. They'll put a couple of senators in the room or chiefs of staff, et cetera. And that's Lockheed Martin thinks that's an audience they need to pay money to have access to, and it's true. So you could charge them $250,000, $500,000, and you'll get up to a revenue base that's pretty solid, especially if you get a streaming service deal. But it'll always be capped because it has no potential to be viral, to get really large with a passionate audience. If you got the stones for it, the right way to do it is build long-term, build identity, build passion, and pick a lane and stick with it. And you can monetize that through the ways that I'm talking about.
No, it definitely makes sense. And it's fantastic that you've been able to capitalize, I think, on all verticals, whether it is having subscribers, whether it is using forms of advertising, you have the merchandise as well, and doing a combination of all of them. And depending on where your users are, I think that's a fantastic approach to sustain yourself long-term as opposed to relying on one or the other. I thank you so much I know you went a little bit over time. I only had one last question that I wanted to ask you, which was this past year, obviously, has been pretty traumatic. We've lived in a pandemic, and I'm just curious, has the pandemic affected your company or the industry that you're in?
So we went through the same things that everybody did in the pandemic. The initial drop in advertising revenue because everybody was really worried about what the world was going to look like. And then it rebounded. I think it did for a lot of people. And then the news cycle in our particular industry was so strong that we wound up having CPMs that were higher than we used to have and fill rates that were higher than we used to have. And honestly, CPMs that were higher than non-news. And I say that because it's usually surprising. There's usually a news discount for the same brand safety reasons that we talked about. Oh, I'm worried, and et cetera. But now people are like, that's what everybody's watching. I don't want to say told you, but I might have just said it. So we rebounded in ad sales that way. The election cycle drove good paying subscribers, and we did an audience funding campaign to sustain us, and that worked. So a lot of those things came in to save the day in the latter half of the year and left us in pretty good shape. And again, it probably depends on which lane you picked. And so if you picked a lane for big corporate advertisers without much of an audience, you might have had a tougher time because you lose a couple of contracts. Now you're reeling and you don't have the base of viewers enough to sustain you through the subscriber model. So it appears, and now I'm worried about, I'm going to knock on wood, but it appears that we chose wisely to at least survive this, honestly, disaster for the whole world.
Interesting. Cenk, I actually wanted to ask you one last question before we close out. You're a man that's been ahead of the curve, I think, in both the content that you create, the area that you focus on. I'm just curious, where do you think the future of news and political content is going and how it's evolving? Where do you see TYT in that evolution?
Yeah, now this is going to be an amusingly technical answer when you ask an editorial question. What's going to happen is dynamic ad insertion on YouTube and eventually Facebook and Twitch. And when that happens, something that I am planning for right now, and most people do not expect at all, will happen, which is live streams starting on YouTube, but then eventually on all those platforms will absolutely explode. And because they will monetize at a rate that we are previously unaccustomed to, because we're used to one pre-roll or maybe one mid-roll, or if you're super lucky, a pre-roll and a mid-roll. Okay, so that's 2 ads and that's it. That's why people starve in digital media. Okay. But when you have a live stream going and you're in news and people watch news live, then they're getting 30 ads an hour. Okay. We've already seen that play out in the OTTs. They just don't have enough audience. When you marry that to the audience that exists on the bigger platforms, I know we're going to steamroll people and we're going to seem like a 20-year overnight success. And I swear to God, hear me now, quote me later. People will say, where the hell did TYT come from? How'd they get so big so quick? Now, the reality is we're already big. They just can't see it. Part of the reason they can't see it is folks are understandably obsessed with revenue and monetization. So when that monetization catches up with the audience, there will be an explosion. And it's not just for us, it's for the whole ecosystem. So what that will do is that will create for us competitors below us, not above us. Enterprising young people who are creating their own news stations will be a much bigger threat than CNN and MSNBC, who are stuck on cable news and because of their pre-existing contracts cannot get off of cable news with their main content. At that point, they're at our mercy. Every day they will have a smaller audience on cable, and every day we will have a larger and larger audience on our live streams on the giant platforms. So that is a recipe for success for us and doom for them. It doesn't mean we can get complacent. We still have to execute. And there'll be plenty of competitors once people see the money. And some will be professional, some will be organic. And it's our job to win in that jungle. Luckily, we were born in that jungle. We grew up in that jungle. So we're ready. But for the old media, they've got a very rude surprise headed in their direction. And it's going to hit like a 2x4 across the head. Proverbially, not physically.
Cenk, this is fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I think that's some fantastic insight as well as what we can expect from the future of TYT. Before I close out, did you have anything, things that you want to announce to the audience or anything you'd like to share?
Sure. We're forever building new content. And first of all, just whatever platform you watch on, just type in TYT. You'll get us. Okay. We're on almost every single one. And we've got 24-hour streams or 30-second videos, whatever is your taste. Of course, you can come to our website at tyt.com to check out us in our entirety. But we're going to get more seriously into podcasting. We've done it as a side venture, not paying much attention to it, but we're going to focus some of our resources there. We're excited about Twitch. I think our presence on Twitch is growing really fast and the news ecosystem there is very underdeveloped. We're actually number 2, and on that platform, number 1 on Twitch in news is a former TYT host. So, who, by the way, happens to be my nephew. So you can see how the new world is taking over. So come check us out on whichever platform you're on. And if you've got an open mind, you might be pleasantly surprised at how much fun it is, how much you learn, and how passion is a positive thing, not a bad thing.
Cenk, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time, your insights. And again, why we had this conversation, we looked at thousands of companies in the content space, and what you guys done TYT since the beginning has been impressive. They've been ahead of the curve every single time. They recognize where a lot of the emerging audience is coming from. You've dominated on every platform on how you aggressively take on both content distribution. You have a unique set of content that survived the internet users and how brutal they can be, but found that right mix of winning in both news and politics, which is by far one of the hardest places to compete in. And I don't think I've seen any other company that has rose from the bottom up and is dominated and continue to accelerate like you guys do today. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate you having us on. And as you can tell, I love the conversation.